In a fluorescent-lit conference room on the third floor of the county planning office, 6 state engineers sat around a table covered in blueprints, cost estimates, and a single, unopened cardboard tube that nobody in the room had wanted to open. For 11 months. The Department of Transportation had insisted there was only one way to route the new highway through Miller's Creek, straight through an old man's 72 acres of farmland, a route projected to cost the state almost $4 million in blasting, rerouting a river channel, and reinforcing unstable clay soil. The old man had said no. He had said no again. And when the state's final offer landed on his kitchen table, $18,000 for land his family had worked for 3 generations, he had simply nodded, walked to his barn, and come back carrying a stack of paper so old it crackled at the folds. What was inside that cardboard tube would force the state to tear up 11 months of engineering work. It would save taxpayers an estimated $6 million. And it would prove that the man they had dismissed as a stubborn farmer had, 70 years earlier, walked every inch of that land with a transit and a notebook, and had known something the state's modern surveyors had completely missed. This is the story of how one man's hand-drawn maps made in the 1950s, with nothing but a compass, a chain, and patience, ended up outsmarting a multi-million-dollar government survey, and why the land he refused to sell for $18,000 turned out to be worth far more than money. The story begins not with a highway, but with a letter. It arrived on a Tuesday in early spring, addressed to Walter Hargrove, 78 years old, a retired surveyor and lifelong farmer who had lived on the same stretch of land outside Miller's Creek since he was 6 years old. The letter was from the State Department of Transportation, and it was polite in the way that official letters are polite when they have already decided what is going to happen and are simply informing you of it. The state, the letter explained, was moving forward with the long-planned Route 9 bypass, a highway meant to divert heavy freight traffic away from the congested main street of Miller's Creek and connect 2 growing industrial corridors 30 miles apart. The engineers had studied the land for the better part of 2 years. They had flown drones over it, run soil samples, and modeled water tables. And after all that work, they had settled on a route that cut directly through the middle of Walter's property, following the low, flat bottomland along Miller's Creek itself. The offer for the 72 acres the state needed was $18,000. Walter read the letter twice at his kitchen table, then set it down next to his coffee cup, and looked out the window at the land in question, pasture, that sloped down toward the creek, a stand of old oaks his grandfather had planted as a windbreak, and the low fields where he, still out of habit more than necessity, planted a few acres of corn every year. He was not, by nature, a man who fought with institutions. He had spent 35 years working as a licensed land surveyor for the county before he retired, and in that career, he had learned to respect government process even when he privately thought it was wrong. But $18,000 for 72 acres, land that included creek frontage, mature timber, and a natural spring, was not just insulting. It was, to a man who had spent his professional life calculating the value of land down to the square foot, obviously incorrect. He called the number listed on the letter. A project coordinator named Denise Alvarez picked up, and Walter, calm and measured, asked how the appraisal had been calculated. "It's based on comparable agricultural sales in the county over the past 3 years, she told him, plus an adjustment for the creek floodplain designation, which actually reduces the buildable value of the land. "The floodplain designation is wrong," Walter said. "That land hasn't flooded in 60 years. I regraded the creek bank myself in 1961. There was a pause on the line, the particular pause of someone reading from a screen rather than listening. "I can note that for the file, sir, but the appraisal stands unless you have a certified survey that contradicts the floodplain mapping." "I have a certified survey," Walter said. "I did it myself. In 1957. I'm not sure a survey from 1957 would be admissible for a current floodplain determination," Denise said, not unkindly. "The regulations have changed quite a bit since then." Walter thanked her and hung up. He did not raise his voice during the call, and he did not raise it afterward, but something in him had settled into a quiet, patient resolve. He was not going to sell his land for $18,000. And more than that, he was increasingly certain that the state's entire route was a mistake. Not just an unfair one, but an expensive one, built on assumptions about his land that were simply wrong. To understand why Walter was so certain, it helps to understand who he had been before he was an old farmer being lowballed by a state agency. Walter Hargrove had trained as a land surveyor in the early 1950s, apprenticing under a surveyor named Earl Doss, who had in turn learned the trade from a generation of men who surveyed land the old way, with a transit, a gunter's chain, a plumb bob, and a steel tape walking every boundary line themselves, rather than trusting an aerial photograph. It was slow work. A single survey of a few hundred acres could take weeks, but it produced something that aerial photography and satellite mapping, for all their speed, often missed: an intimate on-the-ground understanding of how water moved across land where the bedrock sat close to the surface, where soil turned soft and unreliable underfoot, and where a few feet in either direction, the difference between solid ground and a hidden sinkhole, could be the difference between a road that lasted 50 years and one that failed in 5. In 1956, at 22 years old, Walter had been hired to survey his own family's land and the adjoining parcels along Miller's Creek as part of a county-wide effort to formalize property boundaries that had previously been recorded only in vague, handwritten deeds dating back to the 1800s, descriptions like, "from the large oak to the bend in the creek, thence north to the fence post." For the better part of 2 years, young Walter walked that land in every season in mud and frost and summer heat, recording not just boundary lines, but everything he thought a future surveyor or a future engineer might need to know: where the creek had historically flooded before an old mill dam upstream had failed and lowered the water table permanently, where a vein of soft, unstable clay ran beneath what looked from the surface like solid pasture, where the bedrock rose close enough to the surface on the eastern ridge that it would make excellent stable footing for any future construction, and where a natural spring fed into the creek at a specific bend, a detail that mattered enormously for anyone planning to build near it because that spring kept the surrounding soil saturated year-round in a way that no dry season inspection would ever reveal. He recorded all of this not in the clinical shorthand of a modern engineering report, but in a personal, almost narrative style, hand-drawn maps annotated with small careful notes in pencil, some of them practical, some of them almost affectionate. "Ground here holds firm even after 3 days of rain, good building ground. Clay pocket runs roughly 40 feet wide, avoid heavy loads. Spring never runs dry, even in drought years." Grandfather remembered it flowing in the dust bowl. When Walter finished the survey in 1958, he filed the official version with the county recorder's office, as required, but he kept his personal field notebooks and the original hand-drawn maps, storing them in a wooden trunk in his barn, where they sat mostly forgotten for the next 65 years, until a letter offering him $18,000 for his land arrived and made him think for the first time in decades about what exactly was underneath the ground the state wanted to build on. To understand why the state's proposed route was so expensive, it's worth walking through what the engineers had actually planned, because on paper it looked reasonable. The Route 9 bypass needed to connect an industrial park on the northern side of Miller's Creek to a rail freight terminal on the southern side, a distance of roughly 6 miles. The most direct path followed the natural low ground along the creek itself, flat, easy to grade, and requiring minimal elevation change, which meant lower construction costs for the roadbed itself. On satellite imagery and in the state's soil database, compiled mostly from county-wide surveys done in the 1980s, using less precise methods, the low bottomland along the creek appeared to be solid, stable ground, interrupted only by the floodplain designation that the state had already priced into its offer to Walter. What the state's engineers did not know, because it was not in any digital record, any satellite scan, or any modern soil database, was that a significant stretch of that bottomland sat directly on top of the unstable clay pocket Walter had mapped in 1957. Nor did they know about the natural spring that kept a wide swath of the proposed roadbed saturated year-round, a condition that would require expensive engineered drainage and soil stabilization to prevent the road from slowly sinking and cracking within a decade of construction. The state's engineers had planned to address the floodplain designation with elevated roadbed construction and reinforced culverts, a solution budgeted at just under $4 million, a cost built entirely on the assumption that the underlying soil, once elevated above the floodplain, would be stable. It would not have been. Walter knew this not from a hunch, but from 65-year-old field notes describing exactly how that soil behaved under saturation, because he had watched it happen with his own eyes as a young man, testing the ground himself with a soil auger on a rainy October afternoon in 1957. He also knew something else the state didn't. A better route existed. On the eastern edge of his property, along the ridge where bedrock ran close to the surface, the ground was firm, well-drained, and required almost no additional engineering to support a road. It was a slightly longer path, adding perhaps 400 yards to the total route, but it avoided the clay pocket, avoided the spring, and would need none of the expensive elevated construction the state had budgeted for the creek bottom route. The problem was that nobody at the Department of Transportation had any reason to know this ridge existed as a viable alternative, because in 60 years of digital mapping and satellite-based soil surveys, it had never been recorded as anything other than moderately sloped upland. Agricultural use, a description that on paper looked less convenient than the flat bottomland the state had already chosen. Walter did not immediately go to the county with his old maps. His first instinct, shaped by decades of professional caution, was to make sure he was right before he made any claims. He spent the better part of 2 weeks that spring doing something he had not done in years, walking his own land with the same care he once brought to surveying other people's. He pulled his old trunk down from the barn loft, wiped 6 decades of dust off the leather straps, and spread the original 1957 field maps across his kitchen table, weighing down the curling corners with coffee mugs and a cast-iron skillet. He cross-referenced his old notes against the ground itself, walking the proposed route with a modern soil probe. He borrowed from a neighbor confirming that the clay pocket he'd mapped as a young man was still exactly where he'd recorded it. Of course it was. Clay pockets do not move, and that the spring he'd noted still ran steady and cold at the same bend in the creek. Only when he was certain when the physical ground matched his 65-year-old notes almost to the foot did he call the county planning office again. Not the state coordinator this time, but an old friend, a semi-retired county engineer named Frank Ostrowski, who had worked alongside Walter decades earlier and still occasionally consulted on local infrastructure projects. "Frank, I need you to look at something," Walter said, "and I need you to tell me honestly if I'm an old man seeing things or if I'm right." Frank came out the following weekend. Walter walked him through the maps, then walked him across the land itself, showing him the soft ground at the clay pocket, now marked with orange survey flags Walter had planted himself, and the steady flow of the spring. Frank, who had spent his own career reviewing soil reports and construction failures, crouched down at the edge of the marked clay zone, pushed his hand into the ground, and was quiet for a long moment. "Walter," he finally said, "if this is accurate and it looks accurate, the state is about to build a $4 million highway on top of a problem that's going to show up in the pavement within 5 years. Sinkholes, cracking, the whole thing." "I know," Walter said. "That's why I haven't taken their $18,000. Frank helped Walter draft a formal letter to the Department of Transportation, attaching photographs of the 1957 maps and a summary of Walter's professional credentials as a former licensed surveyor. The letter was polite, precise, and almost entirely free of accusation. It simply stated that new information, 65-year-old field data still verifiable on the ground today, suggested the proposed route crossed unstable soil conditions that did not appear in current state records, and that an alternative route along the eastern ridge of the property might avoid these issues while requiring only a minor adjustment to the overall path. The response, when it came 3 weeks later, was polite but dismissive. The state's soil engineering team had reviewed the property using current geotechnical survey methods, the letter explained, and while they appreciated Mr. Hargrove's historical documentation, current data would take precedence in engineering decisions. The offer of $18,000 would stand, with a note that continued refusal to sell could result in the state pursuing the acquisition through eminent domain proceedings. It was, Walter would later say, the word eminent domain that changed the fight from one about fairness into one about proof. Walter understood from his decades in the profession that a retired surveyor's word and a stack of old paper would not be enough to stop a state agency that had already committed 11 months of engineering work and public announcements to a specific route. He needed something harder to dismiss. He began, with Frank's help, assembling a proper case. First, they had the original 1957 maps professionally scanned and digitized at a local print shop, preserving every pencil annotation in crisp, high-resolution detail, no longer 65-year-old fragile paper that could be waved away as sentimental nostalgia, but a document that could sit alongside any modern engineering report. Second, Walter, still licensed as a surveyor in an emeritus capacity through the state board, conducted a new soil survey of both the proposed creek bottom route and his alternative ridge route using modern equipment. This time, a penetrometer and a set of soil test kits Frank helped him source, producing current, dated, scientifically documented proof that the clay instability he'd recorded in 1957 was still there in the present day. Third, and this was Frank's idea, they reached out to a geotechnical engineering firm in the state capital that had, coincidentally, done consulting work on a different highway failure 8 years earlier, a stretch of road 2 counties over that had required emergency repair after a similarly unstable clay layer had gone undetected during initial surveying. The firm's lead engineer, a woman named Priya Chandrasekaran, agreed to review Walter's documentation on a limited consulting basis, more out of professional curiosity than any expectation of payment. Priya's review took 3 weeks. When it came back, it was more thorough and more damning to the state's original plan than even Walter had expected. Not only did her modern testing confirm the clay pocket's location almost exactly as Walter had drawn it in 1957, off by less than 15 feet, an extraordinary degree of accuracy for hand-measured fieldwork from before the era of GPS. But her analysis estimated that building the state's planned route through that ground would require far more extensive soil stabilization than the state's original $4 million budget accounted for, likely pushing the true cost closer to $7 or $8 million once construction actually began, and the problem revealed itself in the field as these problems always eventually do. Her report also confirmed that the Eastern Ridge route Walter had proposed, the one his 1957 maps showed as sitting on stable near-surface bedrock, would require dramatically less engineering investment. Standard grading and drainage work, nothing exotic, at an estimated cost of roughly $1.5 million for the equivalent stretch of roadbed. Armed with Priya's independent, professionally certified report, Walter and Frank requested a formal meeting with the Department of Transportation's regional office. Not an appeal of the appraisal this time, but a direct challenge to the engineering assumptions behind the entire route. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning in the same third-floor conference room, where, 11 months earlier, the original route through Walter's land had been approved by the same group of state engineers, now sitting across the table from him. Walter arrived with Frank, with Priya Chandrasekaran joining by video call from her office 200 miles away, and with the cardboard tube containing his original 1957 field maps, which he set on the table but did not immediately open. The state's lead engineer, a man named Gregory Sims, who had overseen the Route 9 bypass project, since its inception, opened the meeting with visible skepticism, thanking Walter for his time but noting gently that the state's route had already been through extensive review and that changing course this late in the process would mean months of delay and significant re-engineering costs of its own. "I understand that," Walter said, "but I'd like to show you something before you decide it's not worth the delay." He opened the tube and unrolled the maps across the conference table, weighing the curling corners down with whatever was at hand: a stapler, someone's phone, a coffee mug that one of the junior engineers quickly moved when she realized what she was looking at. The maps were beautiful in the particular way that old field surveys are beautiful: careful pencil lines, small hand-lettered notes in the margins, a scale drawn by hand with a ruler rather than printed by a machine, and dated in the corner, in Walter's own 22-year-old handwriting: October 1957. He walked them through it methodically, the way he had once walked county officials through survey reports decades earlier. He showed them the clay pocket, marked in his original notes and confirmed just weeks earlier by Priya's modern testing. He showed them the natural spring, still flowing exactly where he'd recorded it. And he showed them the eastern ridge marked in his own handwriting 65 years earlier as firm ground, shallow rock. Good drainage. The same ridge that Priya's report now confirmed could support a highway at less than a fifth of the cost the state had budgeted for the creek bottom route. For a long moment, nobody in the room said anything. Gregory Sims studied the map, then studied Priya's report, flipping back and forth between the two as if looking for the seam where they might not match up. He did not find one. "This is remarkably precise for hand-drawn work from the 50s, he finally said. "That was the job," Walter said simply. "We didn't have satellites. We had to actually know the ground." It was Gregory's junior engineer, a woman in her late 20s named Anna Beltran, who had been with the department for only 2 years, who asked the question that mattered most. "If we'd had this 60 years ago, would it have changed anything about how we planned this?" "It should have changed everything about how you planned this," Priya said over the video call, not unkindly but firmly. "This isn't a sentimental document, it's a soil survey. It just happens to be 70 years old and more accurate than the one we've been building a $4 million highway plan on top of." The state did not change its mind in that meeting, and to their credit, they were not expected to. Engineering decisions of that scale require review, verification, and inevitably bureaucratic process. But what did happen in that meeting was that Gregory Sims, to his professional credit, agreed to commission an independent third-party soil assessment of both routes: the original creek bottom path and Walter's proposed Eastern Ridge alternative, before any further land acquisition or construction proceeded. That assessment, completed 6 weeks later by a firm with no prior connection to Walter, to Priya, or to the original state engineering team, confirmed everything Walter's 1957 maps had shown. The creek bottom route sat on unstable, saturated clay that would require extensive and expensive stabilization. The eastern ridge route sat on stable, well-drained ground that required only standard construction methods. The Department of Transportation formally revised the Route 9 bypass plan 3 months after Walter's original letter had arrived on his kitchen table. The new route added roughly 400 yards of additional roadway and required the acquisition of a smaller portion of Walter's land, 23 acres instead of 72. Since the ridge route needed a narrower right-of-way than the original floodplain-adjacent path, along with a small parcel from a neighboring farm that had not previously been part of the project at all, the state's revised cost estimate for the ridge route, factoring in the additional acreage negotiation and the redesigned roadbed, came in at just under $2 million for the affected stretch, compared to the $7 to $8 million the original creek bottom route would likely have ultimately cost once construction revealed the instability the state's own modern soil database had failed to detect. For the 23 acres the state actually needed under the new route, Walter was offered and accepted a payment of $31,000, not because the land itself had suddenly become more valuable per acre, but because the negotiation, informed now by Walter's own documented history with the land and the state's evident respect for his expertise, reflected a fairer appraisal than the original rushed offer had. He also negotiated separately a small consulting fee for the soil documentation work he and Priya had provided, formalized as a modest contract with the Department of Transportation, a detail Walter found quietly amusing given that 6 months earlier, the same department had suggested his 1957 survey work might not even be admissible. It's worth pausing at this point in the story to be precise about what the discovery of Walter's old maps actually saved, because the numbers involved are large enough to sound exaggerated if left vague. The original creek bottom route was budgeted at just under $4 million for construction, a figure that assumed standard soil stabilization methods would be sufficient to manage the floodplain designation the state had already identified. Priya Chandrasekaran's independent analysis, based on the actual soil conditions Walter's maps had identified and modern testing had confirmed, estimated that the true cost of building on that unstable ground, accounting for the clay pocket's tendency to shift under load and the spring's year-round saturation of the surrounding soil, would likely have pushed final construction costs to between $7 and $8 million once the problem revealed itself during or shortly after construction. A pattern that engineers in the field refer to with a certain dark humor as the road finding out for you. Beyond the raw construction cost, there was the near certainty of expensive remediation within the road's first decade of use, the kind of cracking, settling, and repeated resurfacing that unstable subsoil produces, adding millions more in maintenance costs over the following 20 years' costs that would have fallen on the same state transportation budget, and by extension, the same taxpayers who had approved the original project as a cost-effective solution. The revised ridge route, informed by Walter's 65-year-old field notes, came in at just under $2 million for construction, with a soil foundation that Priya's report described as requiring minimal long-term maintenance investment beyond standard resurfacing schedules. Taken together, the difference in original construction costs, the avoided remediation expenses, and the difference in long-term maintenance projections, the state's own internal review, conducted after the route change was finalized, estimated the total savings at approximately $6 million over the road's projected 50-year service life. $6 million discovered not by a new survey, not by better satellite technology, not by some breakthrough in modern soil science, but by an 80-year-old cardboard tube in a barn. Holding maps drawn by hand by a 22-year-old man, walking his own family's land with a compass, and a notebook 70 years before anyone thought to ask him what he already knew. The Route 9 bypass opened to traffic roughly 14 months after the state's original letter had first arrived at Walter Hargrove's kitchen table. It follows the eastern ridge of what was once Walter's 72-acre property. Curving slightly wider around the old Bottomland, along Miller's Creek, than the original plan had called for, passing close enough to Walter's remaining farmhouse that he can from his porch in the evenings hear the low, steady hum of freight trucks that no longer have to pass through the narrow streets of Miller's Creek's town center. The creek itself, and the natural spring that fed it, remain undisturbed, still running along the low ground that the original state engineers had once planned to elevate and reinforce at a cost the state never actually had to pay. The old oak trees Walter's grandfather planted as a windbreak still stand now within view of a highway, rather than at the center of one, a small accidental preservation that came about only because a road that was never supposed to be there had in the end never needed to be built. Walter, now in his early 80s, still keeps the original 1957 field maps in their wooden trunk, though the cardboard tube he carried them into that first state meeting now sits somewhat proudly on a shelf in his den, a small, unglamorous monument to the idea that some knowledge simply does not go out of date. He has on occasion been asked by local schools and by a county historical society to speak about the experience, and he tends to tell the story with less drama than it perhaps deserves, framing it less as a triumph over the state and more as a simple practical lesson about the value of paying close attention to the ground beneath your feet, a lesson he says his old mentor Earl Doss had tried to teach him 70 years earlier, and that, in the end, took the government of an entire state several $1 million to relearn on its own. The Department of Transportation, for its part, quietly updated its internal soil survey protocols following the Route 9 project, adding a formal step requiring project engineers to search county historical archives for pre-digital survey records before finalizing any major route through undeveloped or agricultural land. A small bureaucratic change buried in an appendix of a much longer engineering manual that traces its origin directly back to a retired surveyor who refused to sell his land for $18,000 and went looking instead for the proof that he was right. It would be easy to tell this story as one about stubbornness rewarded, or about an old man outsmarting a faceless bureaucracy, but the truth of it is quieter than that, and perhaps more useful. Walter Hargrove did not win his fight with better lawyers or louder protest. He won it with 65-year-old paper, patiently kept, patiently understood, and when the moment came, patiently explained to people who had every institutional reason to dismiss it, and to their credit, did not. Somewhere in a barn, in an attic, in the bottom drawer of a filing cabinet, there is very often a piece of old, unglamorous paper that knows something the newest technology has not yet caught up to. The story of the Route 9 bypass is, in the end, a reminder that the ground remembers things longer than our databases do, and that sometimes the cheapest way forward is also the oldest one, if only someone takes the time to unroll the map.